for the last couple Sundays, we've been in the middle of this engagement between Jesus and these scribes and these Pharisees, and these guys are just trying to cause problems, and they're trying to trip Jesus up. I mean, they don't know who they're dealing with, but they're trying to trip Jesus up. And last week, like, Jesus put like a really big like bottom line statement in front of them, and Jesus looked at these guys and said, if you're not with me 100%, you're against me. I mean, Jesus laid that down. Like, he put the bottom line down for these guys. Says, if you're not with me, you're against me. And you being against me, that's a bad place to be. It's like, we deal with all of the statements of Christ, and we go through the scriptures, and we see the loving, merciful, wonderful aspects. And we're going to see another wonderful aspect of that this morning as we get there, but you still have to deal with the reality of who Christ is, who God is. Like, we got to deal with the reality of sin and judgment. We have to deal with all those things. We have to deal with the fact, like Jesus said, it's like, if you're not with me, then you're with somebody else, and everything else is against me. Because Jesus is the Son of God. Like, he is God. He says he is the only way to the Father, and he's the only way to heaven. He's the only way to a relationship with God. So it's like, if we're not going that way, then every other way that exists is against him. He's the only way. So that's where Jesus was having this conversation. He was having this kind of hard conversation with these scribes and these Pharisees last week. The conversation is still going on this morning as we get into our passage. We're coming right on the heels of Jesus kind of telling them some difficult things, but we're going to start in verse 38 of Matthew 12, and we're going to read all the way to the end of the chapter. Again, this is the same conversation that's still happening. So Matthew 12, starting in verse 38. It says, then some of the scribes and the Pharisees answered. Again, same guys. Some of these scribes and Pharisees answered, saying, Teacher, we want to see a sign from you. And he answered and said to them, an evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The men of Nineveh will rise up in the judgment of this generation and condemn it, because they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and indeed a greater than Jonah is here. The queen of the south will rise up in judgment of this generation and condemn it, for she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and indeed a greater than Solomon is here. When an unclean spirit goes out of a man, he goes through dry places seeking rest and finds none. Then he says, I will return to my house from which I came. And when he comes, he will find it empty, swept, and put in order. Then he goes and takes with him 7 other spirits, more wicked than himself, and they enter and dwell there. And the last state of that man is worse than the first. So it shall be with this wicked generation. While he was still talking to the multitudes, behold, his mother and brothers stood outside, seeking to speak with him. Then one said to him, Look, your mother and your brothers are standing outside, seeking to speak with you. But he answered and said to the one who told him, Who is my mother, and who are my brothers? And he stretched out his hand toward his disciples and said, Here are my mother and my brothers, for whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and my sister and my mother. So, there's a lot of different things going on here. Then there's like a hard right turn into Jesus is interrupted in what he's talking about. But we're going to kind of work through this. And again, we have to see this in light of the conversation. Jesus has been having this conversation with these guys that are just problematic, and they're trying to bring all these problems. They're trying to tear Jesus down. They're trying to tear his disciples down. And then they show up here, and it seems kind of like a weird turn of events. They're like, they come in our first verse in 38. Again, if we look at that, it says the scribes and the Pharisees, they came up and they answered and they said, Teacher, we want to see a sign from you. And so it's like all of a sudden, like it seems like a weird turn. It's like, oh, you guys think he's a teacher. Like, oh, teacher, we want to see a sign from you. I don't think there's been some radical change of heart in these guys. I think that this is still a ploy. Like this is still like, kind of a plot for them to try to get something to spin. Like they've been trying to spin everything that Jesus has been doing. Like we saw earlier in this chapter, these guys are already at the point where they're trying to plan the murder of Jesus. Like these guys have already begun a plot to say, we need to kill this guy because he's a problem. They've already started that. So they're not coming all of a sudden. They're like, oh, teacher, you're such a good teacher. We want to see a sign from you. That's not what's happening here. Like they keep trying to have something happen, and then they try to spin it. They try to turn people away from Jesus. They're trying to take anything that he does and turns people against him. I think it's just a new scheme that these guys are after. I don't think that they're interested in Jesus. They're not interested in what his power really means. And if we think back through everything that we've been going through, it's like, haven't these guys seen plenty of signs already? It's like every single problem that they're trying to bring up as a result of a sign, a result of Jesus' power at work, as a result of him doing something amazing. Like they have seen the signs. They just haven't read and understood what the signs meant. These guys have been following Jesus, and they've seen him, like even just through this chapter, in the last few chapters, they've seen him cast out demons. They saw him just recently heal the man with the withered hands. They've seen him heal blindness and muteness and paralysis. There's even the part in here where he brought the young girl that was dead back to life. Like, they were there and they saw that. They were there when the guy was like lowered through the roof by his friends to be healed by Jesus. They literally tore a hole in the roof, lowered their friend down to Jesus so that he could heal them. They were there for that. And now they're still saying, oh, Jesus, we need a sign from you. We need to see a sign. Like, there's not some radical turn that's happening in these guys. He healed so many people. Early in the chapter, we saw that like massive crowds followed him. It says he healed every single one of them. The Pharisees weren't there for some of the things, but like we know, sitting on this side of it, Jesus was out on the boat with his disciples. They thought they were going to die because a massive storm hit the sea and they were caught right in the middle of it. Jesus got up in the boat and just spoke, and the storm listened and the storm stopped. Like, there's signs happening all around. The power of Jesus is visible and it's been on display. There's been so much more, but then these guys still, with all of their problem causing, are walking up to Jesus right now. It's like, they have like the nerve to walk up to Jesus after all of these things. And like, we still want another sign. Like, it's like, guys, like, what in the world? Like, all of the signs in the world have been in front of these guys, but they're choosing to ignore them. I don't think they actually cared about a sign. Instead, they're trying to just spin everything that happens and turn people against him. But we know who this is. We know this is Jesus. We know he's the very Son of God. We know he's perfect. We know Jesus is not going to be played for the fool in this situation. Like, you trying to play me? I'm not going to be played like that. Jesus understands what's going on. So we see verse 39 there. These guys are like, we want to see a sign. Verse 39, Jesus answered them, and he's like, another hard words, you know. He says, an evil and adulterous generation seeks a sign, and no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. He's like, you know, you guys, you really want a sign? He says, no sign's going to be given to you. But one, I was like, there's going to be an exception. There's going to be one sign. There's going to be one more sign, big sign, that you guys get to see. And maybe we read this like, what in the world? Like, they're probably like, what in the world are you talking about? Maybe we're like, what in the world are you talking about? What is the sign of the prophet Jonah? It's a weird thing. And if we don't know the story of Jonah, Jonah was one of the prophets in the Old Testament. And there was a point in time where God spoke to Jonah, and God's like, Jonah, I want you to go minister to these people in the city of Nineveh, and I'm going to use you to help save and bring back this city that's going like terrible, like it's full of sin. There's all these issues there. People are doing terrible things. Jonah, I'm going to send you there as like my representative to help save these people in this city. And Jonah's response to God is like, God, I hate those people. Like, that's basically, he's like, I do not like the people of that city. I don't want anything to do with them. And so I'm going to get as far away from them as I possibly can. I mean, Jonah literally hated these people, which is a terrible thing. Like, you're a prophet of God. What's wrong with you, Jonah? Like, God's talking to you. He wants you to work on his behalf, and you hate these people so much, you're not going to go do so. You're not going to listen. And God's like, he got on a boat and started traveling away, like it's the opposite direction. Like, Nineveh's that way, Jonah's going that way, as far as he can possibly get away from it. It's like, don't you know who you're dealing with, Jonah? They get to the point where it's kind of like the disciples a minute ago thought they were going to die in the boat, but like the storms come, and now the boat that Jonah's on, all of the sailors think that they're going to die. They think they're going to die on this boat. And finally, Jonah's like, the storm's because of me. He's like, I'm running away from God. God's brought the storm. Obviously, you guys are all going to die because of me. But he's like, if you want the storm to stop, you can throw me out of the boat, and the storm's going to stop. Like, that's how Jonah's story basically goes. And then we know that God, and I mean, you know, kind of those crazy details, but we know that the true story of Scripture is God sends, as it says in Scripture, a great fish that literally just grabbed Jonah and took him to Nineveh. I mean, that's a crazy story. It sounds crazy, but this great fish grabbed Jonah, swallowed him apparently, took him to where Nineveh was at, basically threw him up on the shore. and we look at that and we think about what this sign is. We think about Jesus saying, like, you guys are going to see the sign of the prophet Jonah? Like, I mean, what does that mean? But Jesus starts to explain it. And you see in verse 40, we see that it says, as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. There's this picture. It's like a foreshadowing. Jesus is making a prophecy here. He's making a prophecy, but he's also relating back. Like, there's so many stories in the Old Testament they're really a very clear picture of Christ and what Christ was going to do. And one of these is Jonah. Like, Jonah was called to be the one to come help save Nineveh. And then there was this part that got him there where he had to be, Jesus isn't going to be dumb like Jonah, obviously, but he had to be swallowed by this fish and then put there for the purpose of helping save this city. But we see that there's this thing where Jonah's gone. He's inside the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. Then he comes out and this whole city ends up being saved. We know where we stand now, that just like Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in that fish, and the Bible's not even 100% clear, and people don't even, there's some debate whether or not Jonah was even alive inside of that fish. Like, did he die inside that fish and God resurrected him onto the land? Like, we don't know that exactly. It doesn't tell us exactly. But we know that as Jonah was gone for 3 days and 3 nights, and he came back to help save that city, so Jesus eventually will be gone for 3 days and 3 nights, and he will come back to help save the whole world. There was a little bit, like a little picture. It's almost like on your computer where you got the thumbnail picture and you got the full-size picture. Jonah's like the thumbnail. Jesus is the big picture. I mean, there's a whole bunch of those instances all through the Old Testament where you get the little picture. And the little picture points towards the big picture of Christ. Like Jonah was in that fish for 3 days. He came out. Jonah, he went and preached God's message, and I think the Bible says like 150,000 people in that city were saved. And then afterwards, Jonah's still like, I still hate these people. and he goes and he sits on this little hill and he's like, God, just kill me now. He's like, Jonah, you're a terrible person. Jesus is nothing like this guy. We might have to go through Jonah after. It's a good picture of, I think, what our heart should be for other people, because Jonah's like the exact opposite in many ways of what our heart should be for other people. Jesus doesn't have those characteristics, but a lot of Jonah's story points towards Jesus. So we know, and it's interesting, like you see in the prophecy really of what Jesus is saying here, is that there's going to be these 3 days and these 3 nights that the Son of Man's not going to be here anymore. Jesus is not going to be here. So that points towards if he's going to be buried in the earth, as it says, it's going to be in the heart of the earth, that implies like he's going to have to die for him to be buried in there. He doesn't say here he's going to die, but there's an implication that he is going to die. He's going to be gone for 3 days and 3 nights. But then it's like, well, it's just 3 days and 3 nights. Usually when you're buried, you're not, it's not like, he didn't check in for 3 days and 3 nights. That's the end of it. But Jesus says, there's something's going to happen. I'm going to die. I'm going to end up in there for 3 days and 3 nights. But then there's an ending point. And the ending point is also a prophecy of the resurrection. There's a picture here of Jesus, like he's making a prophecy that at some point I'm going to die. I'm going to be gone for 3 days and 3 nights. and then it's going to come to an end, and I'm going to be back. There's a really important prophecy that happens here. We can kind of see that more clearly now because we know more of the story. And eventually, once we get to the end of this book, we're going to see it so much more clearly in Matthew 27 and 28 that go through the whole death of Jesus, the burial of Jesus, and then obviously as we celebrate on Easter, the resurrection of Jesus. So Jesus tells these guys, he's like, you're looking for a sign. He's like, you're going to get one. You're going to get a big one. And Jesus does the same thing that he's been doing through, a lot of these interactions. A lot of these interactions, we talked about it last week again. We talked about these interactions where, where there's greater light, there's greater responsibility. Jesus does the same thing for these guys here. Because he makes these comments, and he gives some kind of some parallels. And he talks about in verse 41 and in verse 42, he talks about the men of Nineveh, and he talks about this person called the Queen of the South. And it's like, okay, who are these people? Obviously, the men of Nineveh, we get that. There was a city of Nineveh that Jonah was used to minister to. And so we look at it, where there's greater light, there's greater responsibility. And we see this story of Nineveh. Nineveh was saved because the man, Jonah, showed up with God's message to preach it, and people were saved as a result of it. But Jesus is like, I'm way greater than Jonah. Like, these people listen. They listen to a mere man. They listen to Jonah. Like, I am God standing in front of you. I'm way greater than him. So, there's the greater light, greater responsibility. You have God standing in front of you telling you the truth, and you're not listening. These people listen to Jonah. He's like, these people are going to stand above you because they listened to a man and understood the truth. Like, God's standing here, and you're still not getting it. It's the same thing when he talks about the Queen of the South. There's a story in the Old Testament that talks about the Queen of Sheba. It's likely that she came up out of North Africa or something, but she came and she visited King Solomon. She came to visit King Solomon because the whole earth, King Solomon was obviously one of the kings of Israel. He was David's son. He was, as the Bible says, as God himself said, he was the wisest man to ever live and the wisest man that will ever live from that point onwards. He's the wisest man that's ever lived on this earth because God gave him that supernatural wisdom. It's a really cool story. But there's this point where all of that's the understanding of his great wisdom was spreading through the whole earth. People were understanding it. People were coming to hear what Solomon had to say. And this woman, this queen, came out of North Africa, and she came to hear Solomon. And Solomon shared the truth with her, shared with her the things of the Lord and all of those things. And she understood. She understood. Obviously a super wise, very powerful man, but she understood the truth from the mouth of a man, just like the people of Nineveh. And Jesus is like, she listened to King Solomon. You're not listening to me. I'm way greater than Solomon. The crazy thing too is, one of the names for Jesus is oftentimes the son of David as well, because the Bible says that Jesus would come from David's family line. Well, Solomon was obviously a son of David as well, but Jesus is the greater son of David. It's an incredible thing. And so you see this thing, and it's like, it's kind of like the same thing we've talked about in these last couple of weeks of where there's greater light, there's greater responsibility, but also, where there's greater light, there's also kind of greater consequences on the back of ignoring it. And they're ignoring it. Like, these people listen to men. I'm way greater than these men, and you're not listening to me. Jesus says, the greater one is here, and it's me. And you just aren't listening. We're at this moment where it's like they basically want him to perform some magic trick for him. Like, oh, show us a sign. Do a little trick for us. That's kind of the conversation that's going on here. It's ridiculous. Jesus said there's a huge sign coming, but a lot of these people are going to miss it. And while Jesus is having this conversation with these guys and he's teaching them all of these things, he comes down to verses 43 through 45, and he kind of takes the conversation in another direction. And he says, when an unclean spirit goes out of a man, he goes through dry places seeking rest and finds none. Then he says, I will return to my house from which I came. And when he comes, he finds it empty, swept, and put in order. Then he goes and takes with him 7 other spirits more wicked than himself, and they enter and dwell there. and the last state of that man is worse than the first. So shall it be with this wicked generation. Now, it seems like maybe this comes a little bit out of left field, but it's part of the same conversation still. And this is really still continuing like the warning to these guys that are messing up. And we've talked about this through these passages. We talked about the reality of Satan and of evil. And we saw a few weeks ago where Jesus even said, Satan is like a strong man in a strong man's house. But Jesus is like a stronger man, me, is coming to raid his house, take his stuff. And it's just like the picture being that Jesus, Satan thinks he's in control of all of these things, and Jesus is coming down to raid his house and take his people away from Satan's control. That's the picture. He's like, Satan's strong. He's a strong man. He's like, I'm the stronger man, and I'm coming to take care of my business. Satan can't stop me. That's what he's saying. That's the picture that Jesus is painting in this passage. Jesus is talking to these guys. He's talking about like evil wandering around and looking for a place to call home. And it says here in Jesus' statement that evil finds this person. He says that maybe this person's swept up. Maybe they're cleaned up. Maybe everything looks like it's put in order. Maybe everything looks good. But what does it say there? It says that evil finds the place empty, or he finds the person empty. This person that evil finds is empty on the inside. And then the evil goes and gathers even more evil. And it's like, hey, this person's empty. We can all come live inside of this person. And that's an interesting thing, and it's kind of scary, and it's, there's definitely evil and Satan and demons and such out there. There's the reality that Scripture is so clear that there's like an actual spiritual war going on in this world. We don't like visibly see all of it, but there is the truth of God. There is the church. There is Christ and the Spirit of God and God at work here against obviously the forces of evil that are still out there. We know from where we sit who wins definitively. I mean, when Jesus rose again, that was the moment where the battle was won. Like Satan had no power to turn the tides at that point. He's still fighting. Like it's still like the last remnants of the army still fighting, so it's still causing problems, but Jesus won at that point. He's like, my people have a way back to my Father through me. He declared that at that point. Like the battle was won, but the fight's still going on. So we know that this evil is real. And Jesus is talking to these guys. He's like, you're denying me. You're denying the Messiah. You're denying God's power. Like you just want to see a trick. He's like, you guys are empty on the inside. He's warning them. He's like, you guys are empty on the inside. And his warning for them is that, there is evil out there, and something is going to come looking to fill that emptiness. He's like, you want nothing to do with me. You want nothing to do with who I am. You don't understand what's happening here. You're empty. And in that emptiness, something's going to try to fill that void. Like something is going to try to fill that emptiness inside of you. And what was coming to try to do that was evil. Jesus is looking at these guys, looking at their emptiness, and he's warning them. And it's like, that's kind of scary. It really is. Like this is a really serious warning that he's giving to these guys. And for us, there's in every human being, like there is, there's the spiritual aspect to us. We're body and we're soul and spirit, and it's just like, if there's not good in those places, like if there's not God residing in those places, then there's opportunity for our flesh and for evil to take residence in those places. And I don't want us to get caught up in that. That's a terrible thing. That's a terrible, terrible thing, and we can't ignore that. But we have to see that there is an alternative, obviously, and there's an alternative in Christ, because instead of that emptiness, instead of facing that evil alone, there's an opportunity with it standing right in front of these guys. There's an opportunity to turn to Jesus. And then with that, which is crazy, because obviously there's this kind of, this like hard turn in this passage where we see that there's an opportunity to turn to Jesus, but there's also an opportunity to be part of the family that Jesus is building. And we see that in this passage. Like I said, Jesus is telling these guys that there is emptiness and there is evil without him. Or there is Jesus and there's goodness and there's forgiveness and there's the family that Jesus is building out of all of that. And we see in these next verses, like I said, this is that point where, like, hard right turn. Jesus is talking, Jesus is sharing some of these hard things with these guys, and then somebody speaks up, Jesus, your family's here. It's like, it's kind of interesting that it's all recorded in like this. He's having this hard talk with these guys that are so problematic, and somebody's like, Jesus, your family's outside. And it's just like a real life circumstance that was happening in that moment. And sometimes maybe we don't even think about that. Obviously, I think a lot of us understand, that Jesus was born of Mary, and we know Jesus' mother, Mary. I think a lot of times maybe we forget that Jesus also had 4 brothers. They're half brothers because Jesus was born of Mary by the power of God. So he wasn't born of a male, like a human father. He was born of God the Father and the power of the Spirit of God through Mary. But he had 4 half brothers through his mother Mary and Joseph. And now they're all sitting outside wanting to see him at this moment. And we see Jesus' response to this. Let's read in 46 through 50. It says, while he was still talking to the multitudes, behold, his mother and brothers stood outside seeking to speak with him. Then one said to him, look, your mother and your brothers are standing outside seeking to speak with you. But he answered and said to the one who told him, who is my mother? Who are my brothers? And he stretched out his hand towards his disciples and said, here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. So like I said, we're in the middle of this conversation. We see someone speak up, say, Jesus, your family is outside. But Jesus takes this moment, where this kind of, this little, interruption happens. It's like, it's his family, but it's like, it's an interruption in the conversation he's having. He takes this moment to turn this into a lesson. And it's a big lesson. And it's not like like Jesus says, he says, who is my mother and who are my brothers? And this isn't some like disrespectful comment towards his family. This is lesson time. Jesus wasn't like, oh, who are these people? But notice that Jesus actually, he doesn't put his earthly family on a pedestal. Like he doesn't specifically lift up his earthly family. He doesn't put them on a pedestal. He didn't elevate Mary or his brothers above anyone else. They didn't get some special status because of him. We know that Mary had the incredible opportunity to be used by God to birth Jesus into this world. But she wasn't some special being that was meant for us to worship or to pray to or anything like that. The Bible absolutely never tells us to do that. It never does. But Jesus wasn't talking down to his family. But when this interruption came, he took the opportunity to teach the big picture. The big picture that we see here is that Jesus is building a new family. He's building the very family and household of God, which is ultimately the church, which is ultimately, every true believer on earth, all of earth. It's not just confined within one building or 4 walls. It's every true believer on earth is the family and the church. Jesus was building a new family, and for us, when we see the warnings and stuff, so for us, instead of messing around and messing up like these Pharisees and these scribes were doing, instead of having that emptiness and being worried about that evil, instead of those things, instead of that, we can know him, we can be saved, and we can be welcomed to the family. Jesus looked right at that moment in that room. He looked at his real followers that were right around him. He said, this is my family. Like all these people that were with him, that knew what he was actually about. His family, his blood family is sitting outside. They're waiting for him. But he's like, you people, you guys that know what's going on here, you guys that understand who I am, this is my family. There's a new family that's being built. There's a passage I want to look at real quick. You can turn there if you want. It's in Ephesians 2. I think we've been in Ephesians 2 a few times, but we have not read these verses. But Ephesians 2, and I'll give you a moment. We're going to be just right at the end in 19 through 22. There's so much more of this that is good too, but I'll give you kind of the cliff notes on it, and we'll just read the last verses. Ephesians 2, 19 through 22. And so it says, starting in verse 19, it says, "Now therefore, you are no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God, having been built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone, in whom the whole building, being fitted together, grows into a holy temple in the Lord, in whom you also are being built together for a dwelling place of God in the Spirit." We see these verses here where Jesus, or this is Paul expressing at this moment in time, that's like, there are people, it says they're strangers and foreigners from each other, like maybe from different lands, right? Probably never meeting each other. I mean, it wasn't that long ago, a lot of us had never met each other before. So it's like strangers and foreigners. It's like you guys were all in different places, you're different peoples, you didn't know each other. It's like, but now you can be called fellow citizens and saints and members of the household of God. It says that this is being built upon the foundation. God used people in this process. He calls out the apostles and the prophets. God used people in part of the process to get here. But he says that the chief cornerstone, and if you understand what the cornerstone is, the cornerstone back in those days and the ways that things were built, the cornerstone was necessary. It held the whole building together. Like every stone and everything was directed off of the cornerstone. It was held together by the cornerstone. And so it says Jesus is that stone. When we talk about this building, we talk about his church, we talk about his family being built, it says Jesus is that main stone that holds it all together. He's the most important stone in the building. There's the verses before this too. We won't read those, but it talks about how Jesus is breaking down walls and breaking down problems between peoples. The reason this passage is being written is because you had the Jews and you had the Gentiles, and these two people didn't like each other. They didn't want anything to do with each other. They were like a bunch of Jonahs, I guess. And it's just like they wanted nothing to do with each other. Like, I hate those people. This group hates those people. Even in Jesus, we're still not going to come together. And Paul's like, Jesus came to break down all your problems and bring you together. Like all of your problems culturally that you have, Jesus came to tear all of that down and make one people with him. So you were strangers, you were foreigners, but now in him we come together as fellow citizens and saints and members of the very household and family of God. When we look at Jesus as the chief cornerstone, we look at, that's why we're kind of called, base churches, because Christ is our base. He is the one that all of this is being built on. Jesus is the base of base church. It's like on that little block that we have. It says there's no other foundation that anyone should build than that which is already built, which is Jesus Christ. He is the foundation. That is the reason why we're called what we're called. And there's this picture here that God is building his people or his family into the very house of God. It's not contained in four walls. It's all of the people everywhere that Christ is saving is his family, is his household, is the very temple of God. And in contrast to what Jesus was saying to those guys in Matthew 12, he's like, without me, there's emptiness. Without me, there's opportunity for evil. In that emptiness, evil can find its home, but in God's house and in God's people, because the Spirit of God has taken up residence in people and in his houses, there's no place for that evil anymore. The Spirit of God's not sharing space with evil. It's not how it works. If the Spirit of God is inside of us, and if it's inside of his house, there is no place for evil any longer. Darkness can't stay when the light is there. It doesn't work like that. That's why we need him. That's why we need to be his people. That's why we need to be with his people. That's why God designed his church to be community. Because as a community with him, There's no place for evil anymore. It's a place of protection. It's a place of safety. It's a place of growth. It's a place of acknowledging Him and growing in Him. And it's a place where we can have that corporate community protection from all of the true evil that's still out there. It's still real. I think of that room that Jesus is standing in at that moment. I think I'm way longer than I wanted to be at this point. But I think of this room that Jesus is standing at in this moment, this morning that we've been reading in. And like I said, last week Jesus says, if you're not with me 100%, you're against me. There was two types of people in that room. There were people for Him and there were people against Him. All of earth's now still, every human being can still be classified in either being for Him or being against Him. Jesus says that things are not going to end well for the people that are against Him. Jesus looked at all of the true believers in that room, all of the real disciples. He said, these are my family. He still says that now. It's not some exclusive club to get into Jesus' family. It's not like it's a free gift. Like, it's not some exclusive club. Jesus tells us to acknowledge our sin, to turn away from our sin, to believe in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus for our sin. And it says at that point, like I said, acknowledge your sin, turn to Him. But it still says we also need to turn over the whole, I view myself as Lord of my life, and it's time to see Jesus as Lord and Master of my life. He says, those are the steps. Turn from the sin, believe in Jesus' work, turn over the reins to Him as Master and Lord of our life. With that, we're made part of the family. We're made part of His family, of His household. And it's incredible. I mean, some of us, we have blood family. Some of our blood family maybe is not that great too in a lot of ways. Maybe we've struggled with, our blood family issues. Maybe we've maybe we've always had family problems. I don't know. But there's also this other family now it's not like, our blood family, it's Jesus' blood family. By the blood of Jesus, a new family is being made. I said, it's not some special club that, only certain people can, be a part of. It's open. It's a free gift. Jesus looked at all the people in the room that knew Him, that loved Him, that were following Him, and said, this is my family, and that can be us too.